Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. David Nalbone, to discuss the status of higher education in the United States. Dr. Nalbone is a professor of psychology here at Purdue Northwest. He studies social and political psychology, including stereotypes and prejudice, and how political psychology determines some of the attitudes that people have towards larger issues. He's also here because he's the president of the American Association of University Professors for the state of Indiana. There are 1.5 million faculty members in the United States today. The AAUP has 50,000 members, 500 chapters, 39 state institutions. And primarily the AAUP addresses questions of academic freedom and tenure. Welcome, Dr. Nalbone.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start with maybe you could talk a bit about the AAUP. I just gave the numbers of the number of faculty members in the U.S. and the size of the AAUP, but they seem to have quite an influence on things like academic freedom and tenure processes. Maybe you could expand on that a bit.
Sure. So the AAUP was founded a little over 100 years ago, and it is largely the group that is defining and defending tenure. And for those who are not in higher education, sometimes that term is misunderstood. Tenure is essentially once one has proven oneself, generally through a probationary period of about 6 years, and has been voted upon by one's faculty, one has assurance of lifetime employment, subject to a couple conditions. Even those with tenure can lose their jobs if they do some egregious things. One of the oddest reasons for that is what's known as moral turpitude. We actually operate under a moral clause, so if a tenured faculty member were running a drug ring or something like that, they could lose their job, or gross incompetence. But tenure is there to provide faculty with academic freedom, so we can speak on the issues of the day without fear of losing our jobs. Certainly there's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now. The pandemic is one thing, obviously the war going on in Ukraine is another. If we were not allowed to speak our mind freely without fear of repercussions, we couldn't do our job as effectively. So one of the things as faculty members we need to do is be able to speak on issues, especially controversial and sensitive issues, without fear of being censured or without fear of being terminated.
And that probably affects education. I mean, students. It's not just that it's protecting my right to say something, but it's being able to contribute to a larger discussion so the information can be shared with the larger public. So the public has an interest in.
Right. Yeah, that one of the bigger benefits of tenure and academic freedom is so the public can be made aware of if, say, there's corruption going on, if someone is stealing this or that, or someone is misappropriating resources, doing something. In essence, it gives us the ability to serve as whistleblowers in some sense. Now, whistleblowers are a slightly different concept, but it gives us the freedom to say, here's what I want to say, and I'm not afraid of losing my job because I'm protected in being able to say it. Again, there still are some restrictions on what one can and can't do as a tenured faculty member, but it's designed so that one can speak one's piece without fear of being censored by someone who doesn't want to hear it.
And I think, I mentioned stereotyping and prejudice, and I think about sociologists at the University of Chicago, or even earlier W.E.B. Du Bois, who were doing research on race relations and then publishing that research, both urban and rural, and not that spurred the civil rights movement, but it certainly gave information and perspectives so that the civil rights movement could address these things with some confidence that, look, this is what the research at the University of Chicago has uncovered or unpacked.
Yeah, and at times it can be unpopular. Probably the best example there right now is around critical race theory, which for those who don't know is certainly a very popular topic right now, but I would also point out, as far as I know, it's not being taught at any high schools anywhere in the country, or certainly at lower levels, but it's thought that it is. So if as faculty members we were not allowed to speak on that, people would have an idea of it that is not in line with the facts. So the fact that we can say, this is what it is, this is what it isn't, without fear of any kind of repercussions, that can enlighten the public debate.
Well, I'm a member of the AAUP, and we have a chapter here at P&W. But one of the things that I've noticed is that there seems to be an increase in the number of actions by administrators around the country where people have either been fired or dismissed or hired and then not hired, and the AAUP has responded to that. Is that a trend, or is that something that has been increasing, or is that just kind of a blip in the history?
Yeah, I would say it seems to be a trend in the last few years that administrations, many of them, are getting more aggressive in their top-down fashion and wanting to act unilaterally. Now, it's tough to say on the national level because there's a lot we don't hear about.
Yeah.
I'm in regular communication with the national office, and one thing they chronically say is, you wouldn't believe how many things are crossing our desk, which worries me a little bit. I'm glad they're looking into it. But there's a lot going on. There does seem to be in the last probably 5-10 years an increasing tendency for administrators to act unilaterally and to ignore faculty. And one of the things that the AAUP and I personally, and I know you as well, are in favor of is called shared governance. The idea that universities and colleges are best run when faculty and administrations work together to do that, not when one has sole power and the other is ignored. Increasingly, there are some administrations that think we don't need that model. It's just us administrators calling all the shots. Faculty do what we tell them to do, and that's it. And the evidence, to my mind, doesn't say that's a better model, even though there certainly is a push for it as a better model. It's part of the corporatization model, which says run the university like a business.
Yeah, that was kind of my next question. I mean, it seems that there has been a trend, not just in the universities, but in public schools in many walks of life, where the idea that it has to be run like a business, the corporate model is the best way to go. And you think about Chainsaw Al from GE that would buy something and then lay off everybody and then make a killing for the shareholders. So it seems strange that that model would appear in the universities, but certainly it seems to express that same kind of understanding that the CEO knows best for the company, not the people that work at that company. And it gets translated to something as different as academe.
Yeah, it's an indication of something I think that we know about other things. An idea can be popular without being correct. And I think we've seen 50 years, 55, 60 years of corporatization in higher education hasn't improved things. It's made things dramatically worse. But often the argument is, well, that means we need more of it. If you're given a medicine and the medicine makes you worse,
take more medicine.
Taking 3 times the dose isn't necessarily the best answer. And I'm not a doctor, not a medical doctor, but that sounds to me like that's bad medicine. That is more the problem than it is the solution to what's going on.
The irony to me is the cost of education, higher education in the U.S. continues to go up. We hear repeatedly about student debt and the inability of people to pay even after 20 or 30 years. And I mean, there was some thing about certain private loans that put people in really bad positions. The irony to me is that in Denmark, there's no college tuition. In Chile, there's no college tuition. In other countries, somehow the society is able to organize such that there's no, it doesn't mean it's free, but it means that there are revenues that are provided from the federal government, which is based upon our tax dollars, that are provided to serve our communities. And we don't have that in this country. It just seems, I find that strange.
Right, so I'll say 2 things on that. One, internationally, it's an indication of something that plagues us in the U.S. generally. We don't learn very well from other countries.
Well, we know best.
Yeah, or we are the best. We're always winning. And looking at international indicators, we're not. We're middle of the pack at a lot of things, and we could do better. Healthcare is a good example. We have the most expensive, but not probably the best.
Well, even education's a good example, because I recently read the I don't know what it was, 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade math scores are not the tops, but the U.S. is somewhere in the middle. So the whole program. But like you said, you take the medicine, one of the responses has been, well, we need more private charter schools, not public schools, because public schools are not reaching those things. But I'm not sure the charter schools have a better track record.
If the data were there, I think we would have already seen it. The fact that we're not seeing it is an indication. So the second thing I was going to say on that is, yeah, everyone knows the cost of education for students has gone up dramatically in the past 30, 40 years. The cause of that is not as widely understood. There's a lot of factors going on, including most state legislatures for public institutions such as PNW are dramatically cutting their funding. We get a lot less support than we used to, where does the slack get picked up? One of the things the AAUP did some years ago was actually look at, well, where's this growth going? There's a perception, I would say, by some malign political actors who say, well, that's just the faculty, absorbing all that money, sitting on fat salaries, this and that. Data from the AAUP indicate over the past 50 years, by and large, faculty salaries are flat. As we've seen in studies of the economy generally, most people are not getting more than they used to. There's a percentage at the top that's doing really well. Where we do see the growth in universities, surprise, surprise, really large growth in administrative costs. And there doesn't seem to be any clamor, of which I'm aware of, students saying we need a lot more administration here. But that's what we're seeing. And part of it goes back to, well, if you're going to run a top-down institution, you need more administrators to do it.
You need more
which
at the
gets
top.
Back to, well, should we be doing that in the first place?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the thing about the state legislature, because I noticed that you could almost have a graph that as the capital gains tax was reduced on corporations, not just in this state but other states, that means there's less revenue available for public interests. So as you reduce the capital gains tax, you have less funds available for public education or transportation or many other public services. But if you accept the kind of the neoliberal model and the privatization model, you're trying to boost the benefits to the corporations because they're going to provide jobs and everybody will be better off. But what that means is P&W in particular has lost support from the state legislature, so our tuition's relatively low, but it still is more than it would have to be if we were getting the same funds, even the same funds we were getting 20 years ago. So.
Right, and one of the hidden costs of that kind of neoliberal agenda is, more and more people have been convinced by political leaders, I shouldn't pay for your kid's education. Because it's a private good just for the benefit of you. Whereas there's a good amount of economic studies out there, although we don't share them often enough, which say, if my neighbor gets an education, that benefits me. It benefits the tax base, raises up what the government can do, helps in a lot of ways. But very much the neoliberal agenda has said, nope, only you benefit from your education. Everybody else, you're basically on your own.
That's right. Well, if we could move a little bit, I'd like to talk about the status of higher education in the United States and if there's certain trends that the AAUP has noticed and that you'd like to kind of share with our audience.
Yeah, a couple things. Shouldn't surprise you, a lot of these are concerns. One, we had several folks from the independent colleges of Indiana there, and then another was one of the presidents of the University of Indianapolis. And one of the things they're really concerned about is our international student population is really cratering. And a lot of that is because of political moves at the national level, basically telling immigrants, we don't want you here. And that very much poisons the well, even though there's a new administration in place. There's still a lot of hesitancy to come back. What if a new administration comes back? Is this something we can really trust? So we've lost a lot of international students.
Yeah, I noticed that even here at P&W, we don't have the international students we used to have. So.
Yeah, and at a practical level, that also is a major budgetary issue. Not just students, but frankly, international students tend to pay the highest rates. They're certainly out of state, sometimes out of country, even is the highest rates. So that's problematic. It also hurts the prestige of institutions. It's nice for us to say we've got a bunch of international scholars, and of course, some of them will eventually become international colleagues as faculty members. And if we're drying up that pipeline, we're going to be hurting ourselves in that sense.
There seems to be some problems with financing public higher education. There seems to be some problems with recruiting international students and finding the funds for our own students, U.S. students, to be able to pay and afford. If we put that down to the state of Indiana, again, I understand it's a national problem, but it must play out in every state a little bit differently. So how does it appear in this state? What is the condition of higher education in the state of Indiana? And you're the president of AAUP here, so it's all on you.
Yep, so certainly challenged. So I would point out just within the past year, the Indiana AAUP has put out a couple reports. So we started a couple years ago. This is the second report put out, looking at All the public institutions, all the private institutions within the state, well, higher education, I should say. We didn't look at beauty colleges and so on. Largely, we looked at higher education. And using IPEDS data, which is federal data all institutions must report. And we largely were tracking three main things. The percentage of all salaries and wages, our best proxy for where costs go, devoted to instruction, how much goes to the teaching function. Secondly, to academic administration, basically the provost's office that manages the teaching function. And then thirdly, to institutional support, basically the administrative function. And when we track those three, and we've done, again, 2 reports looking at 5-year time windows. So the last was fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 20. If there are changes going up and down, that tells us what the priorities of the institution are. Several wise people have said budgets reflect priorities. So if we see as an institution,
well, that's true even for a family, right? I mean, the budget represents priorities. If you're going to save to send your kid to college, that's different than if you're going to buy a new car. So
right, and it's also been said budgets are moral documents. Yeah. So I can talk a little bit about the case of PNW, and again, shift out a little bit. We are seeing the last couple of years a decline in our salary and wages devoted to instruction. And the increase has gone not to institutional support, central administration, that's been kind of flat. It's gone up to a couple of other places, academic support, and our student services and other things. And this is something more, we see more at private institutions, where they've really been in an arms race to have the best cafeterias, have the best kind of accoutrements at institutions. It's starting to creep into the publics as well, so it's something we got to be worried about.
Okay, so the other thing is there's declining enrollments nationwide, and some of the explanations are Americans just aren't having sex, so there's not any kids, so there's nobody to go to school. Another thing is that people are just choosing not to go to college because they've decided to work for Amazon. I'm not sure what the explanation is, but how does that play out in the state of Indiana? Has there been a decline in college-age students? Has there been a decline in students enrolling in college? What's the status in our state? So
there's a couple things going on. I won't opine on sex habits, but as of right now, and I'm statewide, I'm not on top of the numbers. I know Northwest Indiana, we're not really down yet. But everywhere across the country, we're looking at what you referenced was called the demographic cliff. Starting about 2026, and again, that's because 18 years after the Great Recession in 2018, when people started having fewer children, we're going to see a substantial dip across the country in college-eligible students. Now, the other trend that you mentioned is even given a certain number of students, there might be fewer who are electing to go to college. In some sense, that's not necessarily bad. If people are going to trade schools and so on, plumbers, electricians, and they don't particularly need college. On the other hand,
if it's because they aren't going to college because they can't afford it, that puts us back to the question of the corporatization and the privatization of the whole state.
Affordability is becoming one of the bigger issues, and I would say it's one of the larger trends we're seeing throughout society is the increasing inequality we're seeing at massive levels, such that people who have resources, it's not an issue for them when tuition goes up. But for a lot of students, and a lot of ours at PNW, every dollar increase in tuition costs for them, that's a choice.
That seems,
do I pay my bills, do I feed my kids, or do I go to classes?
That seems like it takes us back to when education was only for the elite. I mean, after World War II, when we set up the land grant colleges and education and the GI Bill, and everybody was supposed to be available as part of being an American citizen, it seems that that's being lost. That the ability to go to college and afford college becomes a question of socioeconomic standing, which has a lot to do with your current resources, not where you can be or how smart you are or what your possible capabilities are, but it's a reflection of the divisions within society now.
Yeah, and where you stand, which also reflects where you can go. So one of the most disturbing things I saw about 5 years ago was that social mobility in the US is actually lower than it is in Europe. And for the longest time in this country, we said, well, this is the land of opportunity. Come here, you can get ahead, you just work hard. It's easier to do that in Europe than it is in the US. And we'd always been taught education, higher education, is the way to do that. And we're seeing that pipeline isn't working as well as it used to be. So yeah, at a very large kind of structural level, things that are supposed to be helping people get out of poverty, move up, the socioeconomic status are not working the way they used to.
I would reference a sociology book by Bowles and Gintis that was Schooling in Capitalist America. And they pretty much debunked that myth that there was somehow social mobility. And they looked at that over decades and different levels of schooling, and people couldn't afford to go, so they didn't move, or even if they did go, there was a certain limit, a ceiling, a class ceiling, if you will, that they couldn't break through. So, well, these conditions aren't going to go away immediately. I guess part of the question would be, what do you do, right? I mean, Margaret Thatcher famously said there is no alternative, right? So is there anything that the public could do, or parents could do, or students could do, or faculty and students together could? I mean, are there policies that can address this question of income, college ready, support for the academics?
So as with a lot of things, being active will help. It's not necessarily a given, but I'll give you one example. Indiana just had a bill, HB 1134, that was actually tabled and went down, but it would have done some fairly bad things. A lot of people at a grassroots level decided to get organized and say, this is a lousy idea. And that put enough pressure. I believe it died in committee, but it basically put it away. I think we need more of that. We need more people to get involved.
Explain the bill, 1134.
Oh, geez, now I got to sort out. There's a couple different aspects of it. I think one of the bigger things, and you can correct me if your recollection of this is wrong, I think one of it had to deal with what people could say in schools. It was getting to the lines of what are called educational gag orders. And it goes back a little bit to the idea of academic freedom, of saying, you know, if I want to say something is a good or bad policy, I don't need a politician to tell me yes or no.
Especially if you have the research and the statistics and the empirical evidence, you should be able to share that. But no, that order would have said you can't even introduce the evidence, because that would make some students uncomfortable or parents uncomfortable.
And I would say that the larger issue, what to do about this, is we need a bit of a pushback. We don't need politicians telling us how to do our jobs as well. Now, some oversight, that's fine, especially like the Board of Trustees. Their job is to oversee the university at a high level. We don't need them micromanaging what goes on, what's in my syllabus, what's in this or that. And anytime community members can put pressure on legislators, literally the same advice you hear about other general issues in the public, call up your legislators. Tell them, go and visit them, talk to them. They want to hear what you have to say.
Wasn't there a crowd in Indianapolis, though? I mean, they not only called people, but they actually went. I understand there was some.
If I recall, it was something like 200 or 250, some folks there. So again, one individual can't necessarily do a lot, but get together, organize with people, and
they
especially like-minded
represented
folks.
Groups, teachers, unions, and the rest. We don't have much time, but I thought we would talk a little bit, or maybe you could mention the AAUP's proposed merger with the American Federation of Teachers, which would greatly increase the membership of the AAUP. Is it going to change the focus? Because the AFT is a teachers union, they negotiate contracts. The AAUP at this point doesn't do that. What's the merger going to do for the two organizations?
Ooh, good question. I don't have really good answers. It is certainly a big thing.
I know there's colleagues at some universities that actually have a contract, like at Rutgers and Penn State and some other places. It's not generally true in the state of Indiana, but
largely because Indiana is a right-to-work state, which tends to prohibit that.
And also, university professors tend to think of ourselves as professionals, and we would negotiate with our chair or the provost, and we shouldn't be in this blue-collar type thing because we don't work up a sweat, so to speak.
I would argue that that's a bit of the neoliberal assumption. I've got colleagues out at Humboldt State who are part of a union. California is fairly heavily unionized, and they seem to be pretty happy with it.
Well, if Amazon can organize, it seems like it leaves leaves it open for many more. So.
And I would say one of the reasons why it'll be interesting to see this is, again, it fits back to larger trends. There seems to be a push back toward unionization. For the longest time, it's been under attack for about 50 years. And we're seeing a couple of rays of light that it's increasing in some places because it seems to increase the benefits and the pay of those workers.
Again, there's some empirical evidence that would suggest that. Well, Dr. Nalbone, I appreciate the conversation. The time always goes too fast. It's all the time we have on our program today. So I want to thank Dr. Nalbone for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.